that. Got the licks in on Stan Jonathan.
I had a fight with Ben Wilson. He was played him with Philly. I had a fight with him at the Coliseum. And I still say I slipped on the ice. And he got a couple in underneath, but Ben Wilson thought he won that fight, hands down. He thought he won the belt. He thought he was the king of the hill, the world champion. I just beat Clark Gillies, right? And I had to hear that bullshit for like 2 years. And I'm like, I gotta do something with this guy. I am like a crazed person, and I'm throwing punches at him. And I hit him with a couple uppercuts, and I hit him with a couple overhand ones, And at the end of the fight, he ends up falling over on me, and I'm on my back, right? The only reason he's still standing is because I got a hold of him.
Clark Gillies, a legend of the New York Islanders, was the perfect example of one of the most striking contrasts in the history of the National Hockey League. A gentle giant off the ice, and a terrifying warrior the moment someone dared touch one of his teammates. From the brutal knockout of Stan "Bulldog" Jonathan, to the long-awaited revenge on Ben Wilson, to the ice-cold lesson he handed to an arrogant young rookie. Welcome to part 2 on Clark Gillies. And it was Stan Jonathan himself who openly admitted that the punch Clark Gillies landed on him that night was the hardest punch he had ever taken in his entire professional career. It started with humiliation. On October 25, 1980, at Nassau Coliseum, Clark Gillies faced off against Ben Wilson, a young and fearless defenseman for the Philadelphia Flyers, who was rapidly building a reputation as one of the most dangerous fighters in the league. That night, Wilson completely dominated Gillies in a one-sided fight that left the New York Islanders' enforcer battered and embarrassed in front of his home crowd. For a man whose entire identity on the ice was built on protecting his teammates and commanding respect through physical dominance, that defeat cut deep. But here is what made Clark Gillies truly terrifying. He did not react with rage. He waited. For over 3 years, Gillies carried that loss in silence. No public outburst, no reckless retaliation. Then came January 18, 1984, at Chicago Stadium. Wilson had since moved on to the Chicago Blackhawks, but Gillies had not forgotten. Late in the third period, the two men dropped their gloves for a rematch that the hockey world had not seen coming. This time, Gillies was different. He defended calmly, absorbed Wilson's dangerous left hooks without panic, and systematically unloaded a series of powerful right hands that gradually took over the fight. Both men eventually went down to the ice, but the result was no longer in doubt. Wilson himself later acknowledged that Gillies had won that rematch. In a 2024 interview on the podcast Fight Stories, Wilson admitted that fighting Gillies felt like trying to punch a moving brick wall. Not just physically overwhelming, but driven by a will to reclaim his honor that made him nearly impossible to stop. On December 20th, 1983, the New York Islanders hosted the Pittsburgh Penguins at Nassau Coliseum. On the opposing side was Marty McSorley, a young and aggressive rookie who was hungry to make a name for himself in the NHL the fastest way he knew how, by physically intimidating the most respected veterans in the league. McSorley had been throwing his weight around all night, looking for confrontations and pushing boundaries with a recklessness that only someone who had not yet learned the true cost of that behavior would dare attempt. Then, 4 minutes and 5 seconds into the first period, McSorley crossed the line. He targeted Bryan Trottier with a cheap and unnecessary hit, and that was all it took. Gillies did not skate over to issue a warning. He did not give McSorley a chance to reconsider. He simply dropped his stick, and the lesson began. McSorley came in hard, throwing punches with the energy and desperation of a young man trying to prove himself. But Gillies had seen it all before. He absorbed the early flurry with calm, waited for McSorley to burn through his adrenaline, and then methodically returned fire with heavy, controlled right hands that completely overwhelmed the rookie. Former NHL defenseman Larry Playfair once said that Gillies carried a look in his eyes so cold and so final that opponents often wanted to turn and skate away before he even threw a punch. His longtime teammate Bob Nystrom put it plainly: Gillies was not feared because he sought out trouble every night. but because when trouble found him, he always ended it completely. On November 6, 1980, Clark Gillies walked into Boston Garden carrying a weight that very few people understood. Just 1 month earlier, he had been dominated by Ben Wilson in front of his home crowd. Doubts had begun to circulate across the league. Had the New York Islanders enforcer lost his edge? Was the giant from Saskatchewan no longer the most feared man on the ice? The Boston Bruins that night had a clear strategy: use physical intimidation to break the spirit of the reigning Stanley Cup champions. Leading that charge was Stan Jonathan, known throughout the league by his nickname, Bulldog, a forward with an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment and an absolute refusal to back down from anyone. At 11 minutes and 23 seconds into the third period, after Jonathan had repeatedly targeted the skilled players of the Islanders with dangerous and deliberate physicality, Gillies had seen enough. Both men dropped their gloves. Jonathan tried to work low, throwing upward hooks to close the distance, but Gillies used his extraordinary reach to control the space between them, staying patient, staying composed. Then, Jonathan's guard opened for just a fraction of a second, and Gillies delivered a direct right hand at devastating speed. Jonathan dropped to the ice immediately. The fight was over in an instant, and so was the Bruins' appetite for physical confrontation for the rest of the game. Years after retiring, Stan Jonathan openly admitted that the punch Clark Gillies threw that night was the hardest he had ever received in his entire professional career. Legendary hockey journalist Stan Fischler wrote that the knockout reset the order for the Islanders, proving to the entire league that the champions could not only win with skill, but could destroy with force when the moment demanded it. Every legend has a beginning. For Clark Gillies, one of the most revealing moments of his career came not at the height of his dominance, but at the very start of it. On April 26, 1975, the New York Islanders faced the Pittsburgh Penguins in a decisive Game 7 of the playoff semifinals at Civic Arena. Gillies was just 21 years old, a rookie still fighting to earn his place in the league. The stakes could not have been higher. Standing across from him that night was Bob Paradise, a seasoned Pittsburgh Penguins defenseman with a well-earned reputation for toughness and an absolute refusal to be intimidated by anyone, regardless of size or age. 2 minutes and 44 seconds into the first period, Gillies made a calculated decision. He skated straight toward Paradise and issued a challenge, not out of anger, but out of strategy, to establish physical dominance for his team in the most important game of their young season. What followed was one of the most brutal exchanges of Gillies' career. Paradise, despite dislocating his shoulder during the fight, refused to quit and edged out a narrow victory on points. Gillies came away with deep lacerations above and below his eye. By any measure, he had lost the fight. But the young Islanders saw something else entirely. They saw a 21-year-old rookie walk into the fire against a battle-hardened veteran and refuse to take a single step backward. That moment lit a fire in the locker room that carried them to a comeback victory. Goaltender Glenn Resch, known to teammates as Chico, later recalled that Gillies' bloody battle that night was the declaration that gave the entire team the belief they needed to win. In September 1979, the New York Islanders were in crisis. Back-to-back playoff eliminations, first by the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1978, then by the New York Rangers in 1979, had left the team emotionally fractured and searching for answers. Clark Gillies was wearing the captain's C at the time, but he had come to a quiet and brutally honest realization. The weight of that responsibility was restricting his game and his ability to do what he did best on the ice. So he did something almost unheard of in professional sports. He walked into the office of General Manager Bill Torrey and head coach Al Arbour and asked to give the captaincy away. No drama, no negotiation. He nominated Dennis Potvin, a defenseman with a stronger, commanding presence and the mental toughness to withstand the relentless pressure of the New York media, and stepped aside completely. When Dennis Potvin received the captaincy on October 11, 1979, he acknowledged that Gillies had carried the armband as a burden, and that voluntarily surrendering it was one of the most selfless acts he had ever witnessed from a teammate. Goaltender Glenn Resch echoed that sentiment, stating that Gillies' decision was the single most important turning point in building the unity that would drive the Islanders to 4 consecutive Stanley Cup championships from 1980 through 1983. 5 stories. 5 different expressions of the same terrifying truth about Clark Gillies. That his dominance was never about seeking violence, but about the cold, calculated certainty with which he delivered it when it mattered most. Throughout his career, he accumulated over 1,000 minutes in penalties and participated in only 71 recorded fights. That number is remarkably low for a man of his reputation, because most opponents simply chose not to find out what happened when he took his gloves off. Former teammate Mel Bridgman said it best. Every player in the league knew exactly how dangerous Gillies was, and knew that crossing the line in front of him was a decision they would deeply regret. Where do you rank him among the greatest fighters in NHL history? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you so much for watching.